So in 48 hours, you're going to forget 90% of what I tell you this morning. And it won't be because you're not paying attention. It's just the way we're wired as humans. Forgetting is not a bug in the human system. It's actually a feature. Neuroscientists have spent a lot of time actually studying how people react to presentations and how much they can remember. And it turns out that, I almost feel like you should come down here. Can you see me if I'm down here? All right, this is much better for me. It turns out that people only remember about 10% of a presentation 2 days later. And there's not a lot that you can do to move that number. It averages around 10 to 12%. But there is one thing that you can do. And that is you can influence which 10% people remember. So last night, many of you went to the Air and Space Museum. I've been there. Even though I'm from Framingham, I've been down here for quite a while. And you saw this amazing feat of engineering and innovation, Space Shuttle Discovery. And you saw that it flew about over 448 million miles in space, spent 365 days there, all told, over 39 missions, which, did anyone get that right in the quiz? Yeah, 39 missions. And as impressive as that is, as you go through the conference and you go back home, you're going to start forgetting this information. And actually, we know approximately the retention rate that you're going to have. You're going to gradually forget all this information. Now, as impressive as it is. Now, some data is more important than others. You may have heard that there are about 2.5 million moving parts in the shuttle. Now, that sounds like a lot. You know, the average combustion engine has about 200 moving parts. And Tesla has about 17. Tesla has about 17 with its engine. Actually, I'm trying to remember now. How many miles approximately did the shuttle fly? What was that? Who said? I think you said 140. You're going to get a shuttle. All right, sorry. This is going to be sort of like Fenway. And I want to know who can remember how many days in space the shuttle spent. Discovery. 165? All right. All right. I'm going to throw it this way. Whoa. There you go. I played. Yeah, there you go. Here's another one. Right. OK. So, you know, data is important, right? But it's not everything. And about a month ago, I was talking to someone that might sound familiar. If you think about your visit last night, does the name Mike Mullane ring a bell at all? Anybody know who Mike Mullane is? Well, it turns out, whoops, this is Mike Mullane when he was in his younger days. Mike Mullane was actually an astronaut. He still is. And Mike Mullane was a mission specialist on the very first mission of Space Shuttle Discovery, which was on August 30th, 1984. And I had a chance to talk to Mike about a month ago. And I told him that I was going to come see you, and that the night before, you would have been at the Discovery, you would have seen Space Shuttle Discovery at the Air and Space Museum. And so I asked Mike what he would like to tell you about Discovery. And this is what he said. I don't have any sound, guys. All right, hold on a second. Let's start from the beginning. this is Mike. This is me talking with Mike. And this should be Mike narrating.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm astronaut Mike Mullane. I flew 3 times on the space shuttle, and I just wanted to share with you a short narrative of what it's like to launch on a shuttle. About 3 hours before liftoff, we'll walk to the crew quarters, climb to the crew van, drive to the launch pad, take the elevator to the cockpit level, exit that, walk across the access arc. What do you think your heart rate is right here? I guarantee you it's going to be choking you. You're going to feel every beat in your throat. In the white room, we get dressed in our harnesses. Then we get out on our hands and knees and crawl into the cockpit. Technicians inside will help strap us to those chairs, and they'll leave. The side hatch will be closed, and we will be left alone. And while we're awaiting the launch, we're going to be in the grips of 2 fundamental emotions, one of which is fear, gut fear. You will fear for your life out there. But at the same time that fear is on it, you're going to be boundlessly joyful. Because for most astronauts, it truly is a lifetime quest to make this flight. With that in hand, you're going to be overwhelmed with joy. Now, T-minus 6 seconds, the 3 liquid engines start, and that occurs, we get this heavy vibration in the cockpit. T0 to hold down both slow, the powered rocket boosters ignite, and we're slapped into our seats with a force of almost 2 Gs, 2 times gravity as the rocket leaps from the launch pad. 2 minutes and 12 seconds up, the boosters burn out and separate. When that occurs, you're allowed bang. You see this whip of fire across the windscreen as these things are pyrotechnically separated. And now we continue into space on the 3 liquid-fueled engines, burning gas out of that big orange gas tank for another 6.5 minutes. 8.5 minutes up, the autopilot shut off the engines, the gas tank was empty, it was jettisoned. And now we're on our way to meet the International Space Station. So I hope you all enjoyed that short narrative. Hope you have a great meeting, and I wish you all the very best of luck. Bye-bye.
So Mike Mullane and his crew members were immersed in data. I mean, if anybody knew all the ins and outs and the minutia of the mission, it was Mike and his crewmates. Because they were literally putting their lives in the hands of this machine, right? And you hear the emotion that he described, not just fear, but gut fear, right? You're going to fear for your life out there, but also boundless joy, because this is, for many people, the realization of this lifelong dream. And it certainly was for Mike. Now, Mike, when I asked him what specifically he wanted to say, he zoomed in on this. I want to give you a short narrative. He's from Texas originally. I would say narrative, but you get the picture. It's a narrative. And why did he choose a narrative? He could have told you anything about all the ins and outs and the thrusters and all this information, right? Well, it turns out that narratives are really powerful. Stories with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we know from research that's recently come out that narratives are persuasive. So when you're talking to your vice president, you're talking to a prospect, you're talking to a client, data is certainly key, but narratives that include emotion and have a structure from beginning to end are really what we remember. If you think about people walking away 48 hours after a presentation only remembering 10%, the question is, how do we impact that 10%? What's the 10% you're going to want your team to remember after your next all-hands meeting, or your prospect after your next pitch, or your client after another conversation? And then how are you going to ensure that that 10% is what you think is the most important, is the takeaway you want that person to have? And a lot of it starts with narrative. Now, when we talk about narratives, they're easier to remember and understand than just disparate data that's disconnected from any kind of context, right? That helps us remember. And as a result of these stories or these narratives, they impact people's behavior. They impact people's thinking, which can lead to how they feel and how they act. And the benefit of narratives is they've been around for so long that our brains are really wired to think of things in a story structure. So by using a beginning, middle, and an end, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means, we're actually playing to the brain's strengths as far as what it remembers, what it understands, and what it views as important. And if we compare that to non-narratives, which are, as you would expect, statistics, fact sheets, using reason and evidence, it's less relatable. It can be difficult for our brain to really put it in context. Yeah, it understands a statistic, a fact, data, evidence, but it's more likely to forget it if there's no context that's built around it. Right? And so as neuroscientists have looked closely at using narratives as part of communication, they have found sure we're getting the clickers here, that emotions are essential when it comes to memory and decisions. So if we're having a conversation, we're having a meeting, we're having a potential a pitch discussion, we want to think about emotions, not just data, facts, and evidence, which of course are important, but they're part of the story. The story structure involves things like Mike was talking about. Again, somebody who's an engineer on the shuttle decides he wants to tell you a narrative that involves emotions of how he felt and how his crew members felt, because we know from neuroscience that you're more likely to remember those things. And as neuroscientists have looked at this, they've come up with sort of a way of thinking this through. You use a narrative, a story, a beginning, middle, and end to discuss the topic that is at hand. Could be a business problem, could be an opportunity for a client. And you use emotion. And that really helps with memory. And we can't make decisions about things that we can't remember. And when we use emotion, that's one thing that we can remember, the narrative structure that we talked about, because our brains are pre-wired for that. And that aids in decision making. Now, you might say, wait a minute. We do a lot of data here, right? It's like, what about KPIs and ROIs and calculations and visualizations and documentation and then the dashboards, right? What about all that stuff? Well, that's clearly important, and data is essential. It is necessary, but it's not sufficient. And one of the big challenges that we have is knowing how to present data and when to present data in a conversation in a way that's memorable, right? And that can impact how someone behaves and makes a decision. I'm wondering if someone could come up here. We're going to do a little role play. And I wonder if you have any volunteers. I don't have a $50 bill, but I have something else. Who'd like to volunteer? Anyone like to volunteer? Would you come up? When you make eye contact, you know you're in trouble. Come on up here. Come on up. It's going to be very easy, I promise. It's not going to be painful at all. I think all you have to do is just put this on, or get it near your, flip it on, and you should be, or hold it if you're more comfortable. And all you're the executive. Tell me, what's your name?
Vanessa.
Vanessa, nice to meet you. Where are you coming from?
California.
Whereabouts?
Los Angeles.
LA, all right. I was out there not too long ago. All right, so you are the executive in our little role play here.
Okay.
And I am your direct report. Okay, so where it says executive, that's all you have to read. It's really 2 or 3 lines.
Okay.
So you can start loud and proud.
Thanks for coming in over the weekend.
You know, it's all right. I wasn't really enjoying my birthday party that much anyway.
The board scheduled an emergency meeting Monday morning on the Queen of Hearts opportunity. You're the Queen of Hearts expert. I need your recommendation on whether we should purchase the Queen of Hearts or pass on it. I will have 2 minutes to present a recommendation to the board.
I am so glad you asked, Vanessa, because I brought along a few things to talk about here. And I know we're talking about the Queen of Hearts, but I don't think you can understand the Queen of Hearts unless you understand the Queen of Diamonds and the Queen of Clubs and the Queen of Spades. So I want you to have that. I know you only have 2 minutes, but just as context, right? And if we're talking about, if we're talking about hearts, well, of course, you can't talk about the Queen of Hearts unless you're talking about the King of Hearts. The King of Hearts is related, and if you're talking about that, the whole suit is really important here. It's not just about the Queen, and so I've been working on this for quite a long time, and actually I brought along some supporting materials that I thought could really be helpful. I know it's a lot to kind of digest, but it didn't seem fair. I couldn't choose. I didn't know what I should put in and what I shouldn't. So I hope this is helpful as you make your 2-minute presentation. All right, thank you. That's that. Let's give Vanessa a hand for being a good sport. Okay. Raise your hand if that kind of situation rings a bell or you can empathize with poor Vanessa. Yeah. And the truth is, it's not easy to decide what to put in. You have so much information. There's so much in your day-to-day that you do. If you're talking to a customer or a client, there's so many things you could say, right? So it's hard to know what to leave in and what to leave out. But when you do something like that, and I've been on the receiving end of things like that, and it's really frustrating too, right? Because you probably have the information that you're going to get ready to plug right into a discussion, say, with the board. You don't have time to go through everything and try to figure out the answer. And I actually call this dynamic, that's the role play we just did. I actually call this dynamic the sift and the miffed, right? So you have to sift through all this information, trying to find the answer. And it may be in there. And then once you find it, you have to actually, here he is again, still angry. You have to stitch it together, put it in a format, and get it to your customer, your client, or a member of your team. And you weren't expecting to have to do all that. So when you're surrounded by all this data, and you're trying to decide what I should include, right? It's not what you know, it's what they need to know, right? It's not what I know about the topic, because I know a lot about the topic. It's what my VP or someone on my team or my client needs to know about this. So it needs to be tailored in that way. And the other thing I think people get confused sometimes is volume does not equal value. Sometimes people are like, well, I have all this information and I don't, I need to make sure they understand this, really get it. Sometimes people say, well, I have to put everything in there because I don't want them to think that I'm leaving out a crucial detail. Now, you've probably heard the term, the devil is in the details, right? Everyone's heard that term. But when you're in a situation like that, the devil is actually the details, because we don't have enough time to go through all of this information and package it, find exactly the answer to what we are looking for, and then put it on its way and send it to the next person. Now, the question is, how do you do that? How do you take the data that you have, the business question you're trying to answer, the opportunity you think you have for your customer or also for your prospect, and put it together that way, in a way that's packaged, responsive, focused, it answers the question, there's not all this extraneous information the person needs to go through, and it's super relevant to their particular issue. Because when it comes down to it, that's all they care about, is how is this information going to help me solve this problem, overcome this challenge, or take advantage of this opportunity. And I call that the big question. Anyone have an idea on what the big question is? I'm trying to figure out, why should my listener care? Why should they care about what I'm talking about? Everything that I do when I put together information for a client, for someone on my team, for my exec, I need to ask myself, why specifically should they care about this when I'm trying to decide what to put in and what to leave out? Now, how do you start to do that? We talked about all this data, right? KPIs and the ROIs, I'm not going to forget the dashboards, and narrative and emotion, right? How do you blend those things? How do you embed your narrative with information, with data, in a way that really makes sense, beginning, middle, and end, that is all focused on a story your listener wants to hear? And your listeners only really care, you're only listening for the part about, how does this affect me? How does it solve my problem? Why should I care? Why is it relevant? Well, it turns out that sequencing, the order that we use, is very important. We know something about a principle called primacy and recency. Has anyone ever heard the principle of primacy and recency? What it means? Primacy, the first thing; recency, the last thing. So people pay more attention to the first thing you say and the last thing you say. The principle of primacy and recency. So you really need to be deliberate about what you say in the beginning. What was the first thing that I said when I first got up here? Anyone remember? What's that? Yes, you're going to forget. Let's see how my aim is. Oh, sorry. Sorry. Thank you for that. And so, absolutely, they're going to forget. You want to show the preview, not the movie. The average movie is 100 minutes long. It's an hour and 40 minutes. The average preview can only be 2 minutes, so 2% of the total, right? So if you're the director and you're sitting there at 3 in the morning in a dark room watching like 8 hours of footage that you just shot, and you're trying to figure out which pieces go in to that preview, it's not an easy task. But there are certain things to look for, certainly the relevance, and also something that I want you to be aware of, which is the need to hook them in the first 10 seconds. We talked about the importance of primacy and recency, the first thing I say and the last thing I say. It's so critical that people are going to pay most attention to the first thing you say and the last thing you say, so you have to hook them immediately with something that is hyper-relevant and interesting right away. I didn't come up here and say, oh, my name is Mark, and I'm from Framingham originally, and nobody cares. Nobody cares about that. You want to know, how am I going to help you do your job better? And that's normal. There's so much information out there that we really have to filter it through and figure out, what part of it should I care about? Well, it's the part that affects me the most, right? And so I'm going to show you something right now. These are 7 songs. Does anyone recognize any of these songs? Can anyone tell me anything about these songs and what they have in common, maybe, or anything that you notice about these 7? Do any of them look familiar? They all look familiar. Do they have anything in common with each other? Who said Motown? Yes, they are all Motown. Nice catch. These are all Motown #1 hits that were either written or co-written by Berry Gordy, who was a founder of Motown, and he was a producer and also a songwriter. And he was asked, how do you write so many hit songs? And he said, you got to hook them in the first 10 seconds. You have to get their attention immediately. And it actually works. It's very important. You've got to immediately deliver to your listener why they should care and how it impacts their work. Otherwise, they're not listening. It doesn't take long before people's attention starts to drift if I start to talk about things you don't care about, that aren't relevant to your immediate. Vanessa came up here to get a 2-minute recommendation for a 2-minute briefing, and I just like dropping all this stuff on her, most of which is not related. So she has to go back and try to figure out in this pile what actually could be useful, and then stitch that together and then deliver that, and she gets miffed. We all would. We would get angry. So you got to hook them in the first 10 seconds. Now, as we sort of think about this, what I want to also mention to you is that you don't want to get to the point. You always want to start at the point. Now, it seems kind of counterintuitive because we're logical people. We talk about, this happened, and then that happened, and then this third thing happened. So we tend to want to go from kind of walking people through the progression. And the other part of it is you're working hard. You're spending a lot of time in your work. You're invested in what you're doing. And there's a tendency to want to share how you do things with your decision maker or your prospect, not just the result. So when I'm at home and I'm cleaning the kitchen and I'm putting all this stuff away, and it's like the 5th time that I've had to load the dishwasher and my kids are leaving their stuff all around, and then I have to straighten it all up. And then I say to my wife, so I clean the kitchen because first I had to start with getting all those dirty dishes in the glasses. She doesn't care about that. She just wants to make sure, is the kitchen clean? Great. But I want her to feel my pain and having to go through all that. And it was, so frustrating. And it was like a labor. And I just want to make sure she understands. Those are process steps. Whenever you start talking about how, right, your listener doesn't care about how. They weren't there. They didn't do the labor. They're not interested. It doesn't impact them. They want to know what's the bottom line. How does it affect me? And if you start talking about, you take them along this journey, step by step, they will never get to the end, the punchline, with you, because they'll be tuning you out very quickly. Because what you're saying doesn't impact them. It's not what they came for. It's not what they're looking to get. It's not a benefit to them, right? Volume does not equal value. It's not what you know about a subject. It's what they need to know. I know a lot about the Queen of Hearts. I want to share all that and dump all that information out because it was hard to gather it, and I spent all this time focused on it and looking at it from all these different directions. But my executive just wants a recommendation, yes or no, on the purchase. And give it to me in I only have 2 minutes. And I'm probably going to have other parts of my presentation as well. So it's less than a 2-minute piece that she's going to plug in. And now, of course, she can't just plug it in because I haven't given it to her in a form that enables that. So she's got to do this sifting and searching and stitching to make it all happen. No, you want to always start at the point. Sometimes it feels like you're starting in the middle, right? Like I just kind of dropped the punchline in a joke, but I didn't tell you the setup. And that's when you know you're doing it right. When you get to that point. When it feels a little strange, you're going right to the punchline. And all your listener really wants is the punchline. They don't want all the setup that you had to go through to get there. Now, thinking about this, I don't want you to think that I think data isn't important. I worked on Capitol Hill for 20 years, and we didn't do anything until we were sure the facts were right and the evidence was there. And I talked to experts in healthcare, in aviation security, and financial securities, all different issues that I worked on. We started with data. I know that can seem quaint, particularly in this town, that facts were important. It feels a little, hokey and corny. But seriously, you gotta, what you guys are doing with respect to actually getting the answer to the greatest ability that you're able to do that. Looking at all this data and synthesizing it is so important. It has to start with that. But it can't end with that. And you can't drop all that unfiltered information onto your listener if you want them to be interested. They need you to stitch it together and tell them a story from beginning to end. So data, it's a character in your story, but it's not your whole story. And when you're thinking about that, I want you to just remember this. So I told you in the beginning that you're going to forget almost everything that I say in the next 48 hours or so. But I have 10% that I have an impact on. I can't increase the 10% that much, but I do have this 10% that you're going to hold on to. And I would hope, and my goal here, is that for that 10% that your brain allocates to this presentation as time goes on, is that you'll include this, that numbers need a narrative. Your information, the inputs that you're finding, the correlations, all the really interesting stuff, all the data, it needs to be presented in a way that your listener can use and understand and be interested in. And the only reason they're going to use it, be interested, and understand it is if it's hyper-relevant to them. If it's been tailored and filtered, you've done the sifting, you've done the searching, you've done the stitching. You're just handing them over that one piece that makes the most sense to them because it's the most relevant. It's what they need the most. So you're doing all that upfront work. So your listener doesn't have to go through this whole crazy process of trying to figure out what's important and what's not. You've done that, and you've presented it in a way that they'll remember, because we remember things typically in a story format. So remember that data is a character in your story, but it's not your entire story, and that your numbers need a narrative structure to be remembered. And when we have memory, we have feeling, how that impacts it. We have emotion, right? You can include qualitative information, what latest regulatory information, a media story, a case study along with it to give it context, and then the most relevant data so that there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And when you have emotion, with Mike Mullane talking about fear and hope and joy and narrating it, you're more likely to remember that than if he told you exactly how this one particular piece worked on the shuttle. And there are so many things he could have told you, but he stuck to this narrative format for a reason. Your numbers need a narrative. And for those of you who are inclined, this is my signal for you to remember. You got a visualization, which is also very important, right? A visual helps you remember. Figure out, how does my audience like to take in information? My 10% takeaway is your numbers need a narrative. And I know some of you prefer the mathematical formatting of that expression. So I have given it to you that way. N cubed. All you have to remember, your 10%. My 10%, I hope you remember, is N cubed. Numbers need a narrative. And that's all I got. Thanks a lot. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks a lot. Thank you.